What is it that you're making? Is the asset a central piece of the environment or gameplay? What kind of art style do you want to use when creating your asset? And how is the asset supposed to serve its purpose in your game? At least a little bit of planning or just a quick brainstorm will help you visualize the end result, and it may also in many cases make sure that you make your asset in the right way. The more you plan, the more you will avoid any pitfalls you may come across. In this stage of the process, it's also important to collect good reference images that you'll use when modeling your game asset. The more reference you collect and the more images you have at your disposal, the easier it will be to create your asset and make adjustments accordingly. After you've made the right plans for your asset, it is time to start modeling. There's two ways you can go about modeling a game asset. You can either start off with the low poly model or the high poly model, and the workflow for each technique is a bit different. For the sake of this video, I will mainly be covering the low poly first method, but if you are interested in the other way, then there's a lot of great information regarding the process on YouTube and Google, so feel free to search it up. When making the low poly model, there's a couple of important things that you want to keep in mind, and most of them are based on the poly count. Firstly, you need to know how the asset is going to be used in your game, and this will also determine the priority of the asset. Let's say a rifle in a first-person shooter that is always on the screen should be more detailed and have a higher poly count than, let's say, a flower pot in your environment's background. And how much detail do you really need? For a game that will be played on a PC, you're allowed to make more detailed assets, because PCs are a lot more powerful than, say, an iPhone, where if you were making a mobile game, you would need to be more cautious with the amount of polygons in your model. So if you know how the asset is going to be used and on what platform or platforms, it will be a lot easier to make and optimize your asset accordingly. The next step is to UV unwrap the low poly model. The UVs will lay the foundation for the texturing work that will be coming. If you do a lackluster job with unwrapping the UVs, you may get a harder time texturing your asset, and the textures won't be as good as the textures you'd have if you were to do a great job with the UV unwrapping. Some things you need to make sure of are mainly that there's no stretched or deformed looking squares in your UVs. If this is the case, you will have to fix it, or else the textures will have noticeable flaws. Another crucial tip: have a decent amount of space between each UV island. Because if they're all bunched up, you will end up with faulty bakes, which we will get into in a bit. But at the same time, you also want the UV islands to cover up as much of the given area as possible. If not, your textures will lack some quality, and you obviously don't want that. So just make sure that you cover up the space as much as possible. But also keep in mind that you will be baking later, so do have some distance between each UV island. When you're done with the UVs, you want to make the high poly model of your asset. The way to do this is to duplicate the low poly model, and when you've done that, you must not move it around in 3D space. You want it to be at exactly the same spot as the low poly model. Then you'll want to either isolate the high poly model or move it to another layer so you don't get disturbed by the low poly model while working. And now you can add all of the details that you need. Don't worry about the poly count this time though, because the model won't be used in the game itself anyway. The purpose is just to bake the details from the high poly model onto the low poly model. And when you have added all of the details, you want to add edges to all of the corners of the model. This step is necessary because it will leave you with the desired look when you subdivide the surface. And yeah, don't forget to subdivide the surface. It will make your model look as smooth as a baby's butt, and that's exactly what you want. Now as the modeling is done, you can go ahead and bake the high poly model onto the low poly model. The most important maps you need for this is the normal map and ambient occlusion. When you're done, it should leave you with a normal map and ambient occlusion. which if you apply to the low poly model, you will see that it now has the details of the high poly model. Good tools are crucial for this step. The better tools you have for the job, the better end result you will get. If you don't have anything to work with at the moment, I would recommend downloading GIMP. It is a free photo editing program with many similar features as Photoshop. So if you don't have anything else to work with, I would highly recommend downloading GIMP. But I would ultimately recommend Substance Painter because it will give you amazing results really fast. So if you can get Substance Painter, it will make your life so much easier. And if you don't know what it is yet, search it up because I really do think that it will leave you amazed. And when texturing, you should make PBR textures. They will make your asset look the most realistic, and it is currently the best way of texturing. So if you haven't heard of PBR before, make sure to search that up as well. If you really wanted to, you could just leave your asset as it is by now, but if you want to go the extra mile to optimize it as much as possible, I would highly recommend creating LODs for your asset. The idea behind LODs is that the further the player gets away from the asset, or the smaller it gets on the screen, the model will be replaced with a less detailed version of the same asset. The way you make LODs is you just remove edges from the original low poly model, and for the other LODs, you would also just remove even more edges from the first LOD. For a regular prop, it is fine to have 3 LODs or so, but for some assets you would need more or less.